Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Welcome back to the Strategic Classroom. Today, we're dissecting the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Now, we aren't just memorizing dates and locations here. No, we're looking at this conflict as an absolute masterclass in how military doctrine dictates reality on the battlefield. So if you've ever wanted to understand how an abstract theory drawn up on a whiteboard actually turns into physical, on-the-ground resolution, well, you are definitely in the right place.
Here's our strategic syllabus for today. We're going to hit 6 key areas: the premise, the assessment, the setup, the execution, the invisible war, and finally, the resolution. Let's get right to it.
Starting off with Section 1, the premise, or the blueprint of battle.
Look, every military campaign, literally without exception, follows this strict, linear flow. It kicks off with high-level doctrine, which feeds directly into rigorous planning, and then translates straight into battlefield action. It's like a chain reaction. If your doctrine is flawed, the action fails. If the planning is misaligned, yep, the action fails. It is a direct, unbreakable chain of consequence.
And that brings us to a really fascinating question when we look at these two nations back in 1962. India and China actually had pretty similar border force sizes at the time, yet they fought in entirely different ways with vastly different outcomes. So why exactly do armies fight differently when the numbers are basically a tie?
To figure that out, we need to look at Section 2, the assessment, focusing on pre-war evaluation. Check out the stark contrast in mindset leading up to 1962. India was advancing what was known as the forward policy. Basically, the Indian Intelligence Bureau assumed that China wouldn't use force against Indian posts, even if they had the upper hand. But on the flip side, Chinese decision-makers were actively preparing for war. They didn't just cross their fingers and hope for peace. They actually issued counterattack instructions, basically telling their whole army about the aggressive plans they saw in the forward policy. So you have one side assuming peace, and at the exact same time, the other side actively gearing up for a fight.
Because they were operating under this active preparation doctrine, the Chinese intelligence network was constantly running through 3 vital steps: observe, analyze, and decide. They relentlessly observed their opponent's physical and psychological states, and then built operations based exactly on what they saw. It was this continuous, incredibly fast-paced loop. Honestly, it's a framework that's just as vital in a modern corporate boardroom as it is in a combat zone.
Now, to fuel that intelligence loop, the Chinese military leaned heavily into spy warfare, and they operated in absolute extremes. I mean, if a spy succeeded, they were handsomely rewarded. They even treated captured Indian soldiers so lavishly sometimes that the prisoners would convert and literally call their own comrades over. But if an operative failed or broke the rules, the punishment was severe. It created this immense psychological pressure, a brutal but incredibly effective way to keep operatives hyper-focused.
All right, moving on to Section 3, the setup, looking at deception and movement.
So the Chinese army didn't just hide. They actively misled Indian intelligence. It was proactive concealment. They fed false information to completely mask their schedules, their routes, and the real size of their deployments. They even hid the identities of their commanders. Think about the absolute audacity here. They would purposely leave military provisions abandoned or create fake weak spots, specifically to bait Indian troops out of heavily defended positions like Longpu and Chushul. By doing that, they created total surprise and basically dragged the fight into areas they already controlled.
Which brings us to Section 4, the execution, or the brutal geometry of combat.
Okay, the Chinese command noticed that the Indian army loved to camp on hillsides and attack the flanks, so they came up with this bizarre-sounding yet highly specific tactical formation: hard head, soft tail, alarming back, and relaxed stomach. I know, it sounds weird, but here's how it worked. They put their strongest forces right at the front, the hard head. They tucked exhausted troops in the rear, the soft tail. They flanked with sober reserves, the alarming back. And the kicker, they placed incredibly alluring bait at lower elevations, the relaxed stomach, perfectly staged for an ambush. They literally molded their entire physical force to counter the enemy's favorite habits.
And this specific formation allowed them to execute a devastating sequence: fix, divide, and circle, defeat. They used the terrain to funnel the Indian army into narrow valleys. Once they were in there, they sliced the enemy forces into tiny groups, especially early in the war. By severing the communication and cooperation between Indian units, the Chinese forces could maintain local superiority. We're talking 3 to 4 times the manpower in each specific pocket of battle. Divide them, surround them, and defeat them in isolation. It's like taking apart a giant puzzle, piece by piece.
Let's shift gears to Section 5, the invisible war, focusing on psychology and media.
You see,
Chinese commanders masterfully combined the direct methods of weapons and physical combat with the indirect methods of psychology. Yes, they wanted that direct fight on the battlefield, but their broader strategy leaned heavily on indirect psychological warfare to shape the mindset of their own troops, as well as the international community.
This perfectly illustrates the massive gap in information warfare. China ran a tight ship with strictly controlled transparency. Internally, they used media to convince soldiers they were protecting the nation's glory, constantly pumping them up with reports of victory. Internationally, they broadcasted India's actions to frame themselves as the victims. Meanwhile, the Indian media landscape was, well, vastly different. Respected journalists were relying on uncritical narratives, failing to question defense preparedness, and actually glorifying commanders who sometimes had literally zero operational experience. There were even cases where commanders would brief the press about upcoming task forces, talk about a breach of information security. One side treated information like a highly classified weapon, the other side just kind of leaked it.
But it's absolutely crucial we understand the limits of this execution. China was a powerhouse on land, sure, but they completely failed to block foreign military aid from reaching India, aid that included equipment for 13 infantry divisions from the Soviet Union. Why? Well, the young Chinese Navy was absolutely no match for the U.S. 7th Fleet down in the Southern Sea. Plus, they were fully aware that India was a massive strategic asset for both the U.S. and the USSR. They knew that if they blocked that foreign assistance, they might give those superpowers an excuse to jump in, which risked turning a localized border spat into a full-blown global war. So they did the math, played it safe, and let the aid flow.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the resolution, or the strategic end state.
Ultimately, wars end when the overarching objective is achieved. The Chinese leadership went to war with a very specific goal: punish aggressiveness and force conditions for future negotiations. That was it. A quick victory was their best play. Because their goal was so strictly defined, the literal second the Indian army was defeated in those isolated pockets, the objective was met. And because of that, Beijing just voluntarily ended the war. They didn't get greedy and push aimlessly forward. They hit their precise target and they terminated the conflict.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a beautifully simple but absolutely core lesson from military history. Doctrine determines preparation, preparation determines outcome. The 1962 war wasn't just decided by the bravery of individual soldiers or the rugged terrain. It was decided years in advance by how each side chose to prepare based on their foundational beliefs. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on long after we're done here. In your own strategic challenges, are you operating on the active preparation of reality, or are you simply resting on the assumption of peace?